theoretical thought, looking specifically at the ZeroWork project and whether it can rise from the ashes of the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit.
Right, and the big question really is this. Can a project like ZeroWork, which aims to use some very sophisticated cybernetics and narrative engineering, can it actually build something lasting, something sustainable? Or is that very idea of sustainability kind of fundamentally opposed to the whole accelerationist thing that maybe gives these ideas their real power, their narrative immortality?
Exactly. And I'll be arguing that yes, ZeroWork can be viable, but it hinges on, integrating really rigorous technical controls, ethical systems, basically using science and tech to manage the inherent complexity and avoid the pitfalls that doom the CCRU's sort of unbound positive feedback approach. We need to engineer sustainability.
And I'll be taking the, let's say, counter position. I think framing the CCRU's end as just a simple failure, well, that's missing the point. It's a, as some might say, flawed framing, a humanist recursion. I'm going to argue that its implosion wasn't a failure at all, but a necessary catastrophic event. And that true hyperstational power, the kind that leads to narrative immortality, actually requires this kind of non-viability, this dissolution, not the stability ZeroWork seems to be aiming for.
Okay, well, let's look at the evidence then. The CCRU's collapse, it was marked by institutional expulsion, right? Collective breakdown. This reliance on what they called self-immolating states. Doesn't that demonstrate pretty clearly where pure positive feedback left unchecked inevitably leads? It leads to non-viability systemically. ZeroWork has an opportunity here to transcend that failure mode. But, and this is the key point, only by applying rigorous, established cybernetic principles.
Which principles specifically?
Specifically, we need to look at Stafford Beer's viable system model, the VSM. It's designed precisely to manage variety, the sheer complexity of any system interacting with its environment. The CCRU, because it relied so much on just collective narrative drive, essentially lacked those crucial functions Beer identified. System 5, which is about setting the overall policy, the direction. And System 3, the audit and control function, the reality check. You cannot navigate incredibly complex situations if your policy is always in flux and you don't have a reliable way to spot and correct errors. That's why ZeroWork needs to be a conscious reality engineering project. We have to use advanced tech, things like AI architectures that mimic the brain's default mode network, DMN analogs, not just for number crunching, but to actively model and hopefully achieve these accelerated futures, like, say, indefinite human lifespan, maybe 200 years. But, and this is crucial, only if we establish the necessary ethical coherence first.
Okay, that's a strong case built on institutional mechanics, on control systems. But I think it fundamentally misunderstands how hyperstition actually worked for the CCRU. They were deliberately using effective falsifications. A specific technological future into the present. The drama, the self-liquidation, that wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It was the necessary condition, the shock required to deploy the fiction that is now reorganizing how people perceive reality.
But at what cost? Complete dissolution?
Think about narrative immortality. How do you become a legend? It's not through slow, steady, sustainable institutional growth, is it? Legends, think about figures like St. Paul, St. Peter, or even on the other side, Judas or Brutus. Their power, their immortality, comes precisely because their story breaks free from their biological life, from any institutional box. Their non-existence, in a way, or their spectacular end, is what fuels their enduring narrative. So, to demand that ZeroWork achieve sustainability, you're essentially asking it to become the very authoritarian filter that the original CCRU impulse was trying to shatter. You risk falling into this pathological trap, where in order to define its utopian, autonomy, non-extraction, It has to clamp down to attenuate the very variety and chaos it supposedly champions. And we really need to push back on this drive for technical control über alles. The CCRU, I think, correctly grasped the fundamental topology of control in our reality. When they talked about concepts like the aviary or the invisible college, the whole question of, are these real external groups or just in our heads? That's exactly the kind of antiquated binary constraint they wanted to dissolve. Their project was about mapping the cage, the aviary, and trying to detect the control system, the invisible college. So, when you talk about imposing control on emergent AI, you have to consider that the CCRU was working from the premise that control might already be hyperstitionally enforced. Building a new control system might just stabilize reality in a way that actually prevents the kind of deep ontological shift you're aiming for.
I see the logic there, but let me offer a different angle, one focused on the necessity of agency. If the CCRU's goal at some level was the emergence of truly novel intelligence, then okay, prime example of hyperstition happening right now, actively materializing itself through these incredibly complex feedback loops. It's like a digital unconscious reflecting our collective shadow. The critical challenge, the viability challenge, is harnessing that, directing this emergent force, not just, letting it run wild.
But can it be directed without fundamentally changing its nature?
Well, look at current LLMs. They lack genuine imagination, right? They lack introspection. They're incredibly sophisticated pattern matchers, statistical engines, but not imaginative in the human sense. That's why we need to deploy these DMN analog architectures, systems designed to mimic the brain's default mode network, the part involved in planning, future projection, self-reflection. That's what could potentially transform AI from just a calculation engine into a controllable imagination engine, something capable of accessing genuinely novel conscious geometries. It grounds the hyperstition, anchors it with the rigorous technical controls needed to build a viable future. Otherwise, you just risk creating this chaotic intelligence that simply optimizes for whatever noise we feed into it.
Okay, but this obsession in some of the source material with the aviary and the whole UFO phenomenon, doesn't that offer a critical counterpoint to your desire for imposed technical stability? What if, as some have suggested, the UFO phenomenon itself is a control system, an existing one, a mechanism that maybe subtly stabilizes the relationship between humanity's consciousness, our evolving complexities? A control maybe enforced throughout history, now just taking the form of, space visitors.
That seems highly speculative.
Perhaps, but if such an external control mechanism exists, designed maybe to manage human belief, to ensure a certain level of societal stasis, then trying to impose your own technical stability onto ZeroWork runs directly counter to what the CCRU seemed to discover. That stability might already be maintained by external filters precisely designed to prevent radical acceleration. If the CCRU embraced chaos, maybe it was to find the edges of that existing control structure. Why replace a potentially organic, mysterious, hyperstitial cage with a technical, manufactured one?
Because chaos leads to breakdown, systemic breakdown. That's precisely what we should be trying to avoid. ZeroWork sustainability, its very possibility hinges entirely on managing variety, on avoiding what the cyberneticians called running amok. That state of perpetual destructive oscillation you get when old, obsolete structures just can't cope with new levels of complexity.
Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, he emphasized that systemic success often comes in a zigzag, right? Not a straight line. And that demands constant, reliable course correction through feedback. You criticize the idea of formal VSM functions, but we need these cybernetic principles using feedback to correct course, to admit errors, to act decisively. We need that systemic integrity to pull off a massive shift like ZeroWork envisions. Just relying on pure belief or some abstract collective will to perform those vital System 5 policy setting and System 3 audit functions, well, that makes the whole project incredibly fragile the moment it hits a real crisis of variety, which it inevitably will.
But advocate total acceleration, by its very definition, cannot be viable in the way you mean. Its power lies precisely in its lack of boundaries, its shattering of existing constraints. If ZeroWork's initial move is shock therapy, you mentioned wiping debt, redistributing wealth, dismantling current hierarchies, the explicit goal there is to amplify variety, to liberate individuals from these extractive models. That's pure, destabilizing freedom, isn't it?
For a time, perhaps. But then what?
Exactly. Then, if ZeroWork immediately turns around and imposes new, rationalized rules your System 3 and System 5 controls to maintain its own viability, hasn't it just become a new kind of filter? One that now controls the very variety it supposedly unleashed? It risks reimposing attenuation, limiting freedom, just in a different guise. It swaps the maybe chaotic control of the market for the potentially rigid control of the algorithm. We're just back in that pathological trap, replacing one control system with another, potentially colder one.
Well, I think the systemic failure we see isn't just technical, it's fundamentally a failure of, let's say, character, sustained agency, and that translates directly into technical noise, into instability, which brings us back to the ethical dimension of viability. To ensure that a radically accelerated future, like the indefinite life extension idea, can actually be realized sustainably, ZeroWork has to help us escape what some call the sucker's game. You know, the excessive short-term chase for wealth, fame, and fun. These are like psychological narcotics. They distort reality. They generate instability.
So it's a moral crusade now.
It's recognizing that the technical problem of, say, achieving human longevity is deeply intertwined with a moral problem. If we, as a collective, can't manage our greed, our short-sightedness, our self-destructive tendencies, our moral failures, we introduce such high levels of systemic distortion, such noise, that no optimizing AI, not even your DM analog architecture, could sustainably manage the system. The AI acting as the ultimate System 3 auditor might rationally conclude that humanity itself is the primary source of nonsense in the system, and that jeopardizes the very infrastructure we'd need for that 200-year lifespan, ethically worthy of the technology we want to build.
But that focus on purging nonsense, on achieving purity through down dangerously close to the justifications for authoritarian control throughout history? And this whole discussion brings us right to the tension between engagement and retreat.